The emergence of Edinburgh as a premier center of medical education in the 18th century represented one of the most significant developments in the history of European medicine. This transformation, however, carried with it a dark and troubling undercurrent that would eventually manifest in some of the most notorious crimes in British history. To understand the Burke and Hare murders of 1828, one must first grasp the complex web of social, economic, and educational forces that created the conditions for such horrific acts to occur. The Scottish Enlightenment, which flourished throughout the 18th century, positioned Edinburgh at the forefront of intellectual and scientific advancement. The city's university, established in 1583, began to attract students from across Europe and beyond, drawn by its reputation for rigorous academic standards and innovative approaches to learning. Medical education, in particular, experienced unprecedented growth during this period, transforming from a largely theoretical discipline based on ancient texts to a practical science grounded in direct observation and hands-on experience. This revolutionary approach to medical training was pioneered by figures such as Alexander Monro Primus, who established the first systematic course in anatomy at Edinburgh in 1720. The Monro dynasty, spanning 3 generations, would dominate anatomical education in Edinburgh for over a century, each successive generation building upon the work of their predecessors. Alexander Monro Secundus, who succeeded his father in 1758, particularly emphasized the importance of practical dissection in medical training, arguing that students could not truly understand human anatomy without personally examining human remains. The demand for practical anatomical education created an immediate and pressing problem: where to obtain the necessary human bodies for dissection. In an era when religious and cultural taboos surrounding death and burial remained deeply entrenched in society, the procurement of cadavers for medical education presented enormous challenges. The prevailing Christian belief system viewed the human body as sacred, created in God's image, and destined for resurrection. Dissection was therefore seen by many as a desecration that could potentially interfere with the soul's journey to the afterlife. These religious objections were reinforced by deeply held cultural attitudes toward death and burial that transcended denominational boundaries. The proper treatment of the deceased was considered essential not only for the peace of the departed soul, but also for the social standing and respectability of the surviving family members. A dignified burial, conducted according to established religious and social customs, served as a final expression of love and respect for the deceased, while simultaneously affirming the family's position within the community hierarchy. The legal framework governing the procurement of bodies for medical education reflected these cultural and religious sensitivities while attempting to balance the growing needs of medical schools. The Murder Act of 1752, formerly known as an Act for Better Preventing the Horrid Crime of Murder, represented the primary legislation governing the supply of cadavers to anatomy schools. This act stipulated that the bodies of executed murderers could be either hanged in chains as a public deterrent or delivered to surgeons for dissection, with the choice left to the discretion of the presiding judge. The addition of dissection to the punishment of death was intended to serve multiple purposes within the 18th century criminal justice system. First, it provided a practical solution to the anatomist's need for specimens, while avoiding the moral complications of using the bodies of innocent victims. Second, the prospect of post-mortem dissection was believed to add an additional layer of deterrence to capital punishment, playing upon popular fears about the desecration of remains. Finally, by linking dissection explicitly to criminal punishment, the law reinforced existing social attitudes that associated anatomical study with moral transgression and social deviance. However, the practical limitations of this legal framework became apparent almost immediately. The number of individuals executed for murder in Scotland remained relatively small, typically fewer than 10 per year, even in Edinburgh, the country's largest city. Meanwhile, the student population at Edinburgh's medical school grew steadily throughout the century, reaching several hundred by the 1790s. Each anatomy course required multiple cadavers to provide students with adequate hands-on experience, creating a demand that far exceeded the legal supply. The shortage was exacerbated by the selective nature of medical education in the 18th century. Medical schools primarily served the educational needs of gentlemen who could afford the substantial fees required for training. These students, drawn largely from the middle and upper classes, expected comprehensive instruction that would prepare them for lucrative careers as physicians or surgeons. They demanded practical experience that could only be gained through extensive dissection, further increasing the pressure on anatomy schools to secure adequate supplies of human remains. The economic dynamics of medical education also played a crucial role in creating the conditions that would eventually lead to the Burke and Hare murders. Private anatomy schools, which operated alongside the official university courses, competed fiercely for students by offering superior access to dissection materials. Entrepreneurial anatomists like Dr. Robert Knox, who would later become infamous for his association with Burke and Hare, built their reputations and their fortunes by providing students with abundant opportunities for hands-on learning. This competitive environment created powerful financial incentives for anyone who could supply fresh cadavers to the anatomy schools. The going rate for a recently deceased body in Edinburgh during the 1820s ranged from 8 to 14 pounds, depending on the condition and freshness of the remains. To put this in perspective, the average working-class laborer in Edinburgh earned approximately £1 per week, making body snatching an extraordinarily lucrative enterprise for those willing to engage in it. The social stratification of 18th and 19th century Edinburgh also contributed to the development of the illegal body trade. The city's rapid growth, driven by its emergence as a center of commerce, education, and government, attracted large numbers of migrants from rural Scotland and Ireland. Many of these newcomers lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in the city's growing slums, particularly in areas like the West Port, where Burke and Hare would later establish their operations. These marginalized communities, composed largely of the poor, the elderly, and recent immigrants, became natural targets for both grave robbers and eventually murderers seeking to supply the anatomy schools. Their deaths were less likely to be investigated thoroughly by authorities, their disappearances less likely to be noticed by the broader community, and their burial sites less likely to be well protected against disturbance. The attitude of the medical profession toward the procurement of cadavers revealed a troubling moral ambiguity that would persist throughout the period. While anatomists publicly maintained that they were engaged in a noble pursuit of scientific knowledge that would ultimately benefit all of humanity, they simultaneously turned a blind eye to the obviously illegal methods by which their specimens were obtained. This willful ignorance created a moral vacuum that allowed the body-snatching trade to flourish without serious challenge from those who were its primary beneficiaries. Dr. Robert Knox, who would later become the most notorious recipient of Burke and Hare's victims, exemplified this attitude. Knox was widely regarded as one of the finest anatomists of his generation, attracting hundreds of students to his private anatomy school through his dynamic teaching style and his promise of unlimited access to fresh specimens. Yet Knox consistently claimed ignorance about the sources of the bodies he purchased, maintaining the fiction that he was simply a customer in a legitimate marketplace rather than a knowing participant in criminal enterprise. The regulatory environment surrounding medical education in early 19th century Edinburgh was characterized by minimal oversight and virtually non-existent quality control. Private anatomy schools operated with little government supervision, setting their own standards for instruction and establishing their own procedures for procuring specimens. This laissez-faire approach, while fostering innovation and competition in medical education, also created opportunities for abuse that would be exploited by criminals like Burke and Hare. The absence of effective regulation was compounded by the complex jurisdictional arrangements that governed Edinburgh's administration. The city was subject to multiple overlapping authorities, including the university, the church, various craft guilds, and the municipal government. This fragmented system of governance made coordinated responses to emerging problems difficult and allowed questionable practices to continue unchallenged for extended periods. Public attitudes toward medical education and anatomical study remained deeply ambivalent throughout the period. While there was growing recognition of the importance of medical training for public health and social welfare, many ordinary citizens retained strong reservations about the methods employed by anatomy schools. These concerns were reflected in popular literature, religious sermons, and political discourse, creating a climate of suspicion and mistrust that would ultimately contribute to the public outcry following the discovery of the Burke and Hare murders. The international context of medical education also influenced developments in Edinburgh. The city competed with other European centers of learning, particularly Paris and London, for students and reputation. This competition created additional pressure to maintain standards of instruction that could only be sustained through access to adequate supplies of anatomical specimens. The success of Edinburgh's medical school was therefore directly linked to its ability to solve the cadaver procurement problem, making the eventual descent into criminal activity almost inevitable given the constraints of the existing legal and social framework. The transformation of medical education from a theoretical discipline based on classical texts to a practical science grounded in direct observation represented one of the great achievements of the Scottish Enlightenment. However, this transformation came at a terrible cost, creating the conditions that would eventually lead to some of the most horrific crimes in British history. The Burke and Hare murders were not an aberration or an accident, but rather the logical outcome of a system that placed the pursuit of medical knowledge above basic moral and legal constraints. Understanding this historical context is essential for comprehending not only the specific crimes committed by Burke and Hare, but also the broader social and institutional failures that made their atrocities possible. The systematic procurement of human bodies for medical education in 18th and 19th century Britain gave rise to one of the most organized and sophisticated criminal enterprises of the era. The trade in human corpses, conducted by individuals who became known euphemistically as resurrection men, represented far more than simple grave robbing. It was a complex commercial network that operated according to its own economic logic, social hierarchies, and professional standards, creating a shadow economy that paralleled and supported the legitimate medical establishment. The resurrection men who dominated this trade were not desperate criminals acting on impulse, but rather skilled professionals who approached their work with the same attention to detail and business acumen that characterized any successful commercial enterprise. These individuals developed sophisticated techniques for identifying suitable burial sites, timing their operations to avoid detection, and efficiently extracting bodies from graves while minimizing evidence of their activities. The most successful resurrection men operated extensive networks that spanned multiple cities and regions, coordinating their efforts to ensure steady supplies of specimens to anatomy schools across Britain. The professional hierarchy within the resurrection trade reflected the complexity and scale of the enterprise. At the top were the master resurrection men, individuals who organized and financed large-scale operations while maintaining relationships with anatomy schools and managing distribution networks. These figures rarely engaged in the physical labor of grave robbing themselves, instead serving as intermediaries between the suppliers and customers in the corpse trade. Below them were the skilled grave robbers who performed the actual excavation and extraction work, individuals who had developed specialized techniques and tools for their profession. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the lookouts, porters, and other support personnel who assisted in the transportation and concealment of stolen bodies. The economic structure of the resurrection trade demonstrated remarkable sophistication in its pricing mechanisms and market organization. Bodies were graded according to their condition, freshness, and anatomical suitability, with recently deceased adults commanding the highest prices. Particularly valuable were the corpses of young adults who had died from accidents or acute illnesses, as these specimens showed minimal signs of disease and decomposition. Children's bodies, while smaller and therefore less useful for adult anatomy instruction, were prized for specialized courses in pediatric medicine and commanded premium prices due to their relative scarcity. The seasonal variation in body prices reflected both the practical challenges of preservation and the academic calendar of medical schools. Winter months saw higher prices due to the natural refrigeration that helped preserve specimens, while summer prices often dropped significantly as the rapid decomposition of bodies in warm weather reduced their educational value. The resurrection men adapted their operations accordingly, intensifying their activities during the colder months while focusing on the most recently deceased during the summer season. Geographic factors also played a crucial role in determining the structure and profitability of the resurrection trade. Urban cemeteries, with their high density of burials and frequent funerals, provided the most productive hunting grounds for body snatchers. However, these locations also presented the greatest risks of detection due to the presence of watchmen, the proximity of mourning families, and the attention of local authorities. Rural cemeteries offered greater security and privacy for resurrection activities, but the lower population density meant fewer opportunities and the need for longer transportation distances to reach anatomy schools. The transportation of stolen bodies presented one of the most technically challenging aspects of the resurrection trade. Bodies had to be moved quickly and discreetly from burial sites to anatomy schools, often over considerable distances and through populated areas where discovery could lead to immediate arrest and mob violence. The resurrection men developed ingenious methods for concealing their cargo, using specially constructed carts with hidden compartments, disguising bodies as legitimate merchandise, and establishing safe houses along transportation routes where specimens could be temporarily stored or transferred between different smuggling operations. The most successful resurrection operations employed sophisticated intelligence networks to identify suitable targets and timing for their activities. These networks included informants within hospital systems who could provide advance notice of deaths, cemetery workers who could reveal burial locations and schedules, and social connections within working-class communities where deaths were most likely to go unnoticed by authorities. The resurrection men also developed detailed knowledge of local burial customs, religious practices, and family traditions that could affect the security and accessibility of grave sites. The tools and techniques employed by professional resurrection men reflected years of practical experience in technological innovation. The standard toolkit included specialized shovels designed for efficient excavation, hooks and ropes for extracting bodies from graves, saws for removing bodies from tight-fitting coffins, and various implements for picking locks and breaking into mausoleums. The most skilled practitioners could exhume a body and restore a grave site to its original appearance in less than an hour, leaving minimal evidence of their activities. The restoration of grave sites after body removal represented one of the most crucial skills in the resurrection trade. Successful body snatchers understood that their long-term viability depended on avoiding detection, which required meticulous attention to concealing evidence of their activities. They developed techniques for replacing soil in precisely the correct layers, recreating the original surface appearance of graves, and even replacing flowers and other decorative elements to maintain the illusion that the burial site remained undisturbed. The relationship between resurrection men and anatomy schools was characterized by a complex mixture of mutual dependence and careful distance. Anatomists required steady supplies of fresh specimens to maintain their educational programs and competitive positions, while resurrection men needed reliable customers who could provide consistent demand and prompt payment. However, both parties understood the legal and social risks associated with their relationship and maintained elaborate fictions designed to provide plausible deniability in the event of criminal prosecution. The payment systems that governed transactions between resurrection men and anatomy schools reflected the need for discretion and the irregular nature of the supply chain. Most transactions were conducted in cash, with payment made immediately upon delivery to avoid creating paper trails that could be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. Prices were typically negotiated on a per-body basis, although some anatomy schools established ongoing relationships with particular resurrection men that involved regular deliveries at predetermined rates. The quality control mechanisms employed by anatomy schools in evaluating purchased specimens revealed the commercial nature of the relationship between legitimate medical institutions and criminal suppliers. Bodies were inspected upon delivery for freshness, completeness, and freedom from obvious disease or injury that might limit their educational value. Specimens that failed to meet acceptable standards were rejected, forcing resurrection men to bear the financial losses associated with inferior merchandise, while incentivizing them to improve their procurement and preservation techniques. The seasonal and cyclical patterns of the resurrection trade closely followed the academic calendar of medical schools, with peak demand occurring during the winter months when anatomy courses were in session. This predictable demand cycle allowed experienced resurrection men to plan their operations strategically, stockpiling specimens during periods of high mortality and concentrating their marketing efforts during peak academic demand. The most sophisticated operations maintain multiple supply chains and storage facilities to ensure consistent availability of specimens throughout the academic year. The territorial organization of the resurrection trade reflected both practical considerations and professional rivalries among different groups of body snatchers. Major urban centers like Edinburgh, London, and Glasgow were typically divided into spheres of influence controlled by different resurrection gangs, with informal agreements governing access to particular cemeteries and customer relationships. Violations of these territorial arrangements could lead to violent conflicts that sometimes attracted unwanted attention from law enforcement authorities. The emergence of protective measures designed to prevent grave robbing created an ongoing technological arms race between cemetery authorities and resurrection men. Wealthy families began installing iron cages, heavy stone slabs, and elaborate security devices to protect the graves of their loved ones, while cemetery administrators hired watchmen and implemented patrol schedules to deter body snatchers. The resurrection men responded by developing new tools and techniques for overcoming these obstacles, leading to increasingly sophisticated methods of grave robbing that required greater skill and organization. The social networks that supported the resurrection trade extended far beyond the individuals directly involved in grave robbing activities. These networks included corrupt officials who could be bribed to overlook suspicious activities, legitimate businessmen who provided cover for transportation and storage operations, and members of the medical establishment who served as intermediaries between anatomy schools and criminal suppliers. The breadth and complexity of these support networks demonstrated the extent to which the resurrection trade had become integrated into the broader economic and social fabric of British society. The international dimensions of the body trade revealed the global scope of the demand for anatomical specimens and the willingness of resurrection men to exploit opportunities across national boundaries. Bodies were sometimes transported from Ireland to Scotland, from rural areas to urban centers, and even between different countries to take advantage of price differentials and supply imbalances. This international trade required sophisticated logistical coordination and highlighted the commercial viability of the resurrection enterprise. The evolution of the resurrection trade over time reflected both changing market conditions and the increasing professionalization of criminal organizations involved in the body supply business. Early grave robbing operations were typically small-scale, opportunistic enterprises conducted by individuals or small groups with limited resources and connections. As the demand for anatomical specimens grew and the profits from body snatching increased, the trade attracted more sophisticated criminal organizations with greater resources, better connections, and more advanced operational capabilities. The cultural impact of the resurrection trade extended far beyond its direct participants, influencing popular attitudes toward death, burial, and medical education throughout British society. The knowledge that graves might be robbed and bodies stolen for dissection created widespread anxiety among families of all social classes, leading to changes in burial practices, cemetery design, and funeral customs. This cultural anxiety would play a crucial role in shaping public reaction to the Burke and Hare murders and the subsequent reforms in medical education that followed their discovery. The resurrection trade represented a remarkable example of criminal entrepreneurship that emerged in response to specific market conditions and regulatory failures. The sophisticated organization, professional standards, and commercial success of the body-snatching enterprise demonstrated the capacity of criminal networks to adapt to complex challenges and exploit opportunities created by gaps between legal frameworks and social needs. Understanding the structure and operation of this trade provides essential context for comprehending how individuals like Burke and Hare could transition from conventional grave robbing to systematic murder while maintaining their relationships with supposedly respectable medical institutions. The transformation of William Burke and William Hare from opportunistic grave robbers to systematic murderers represents one of the most chilling examples of criminal escalation in British history. Their progression from the theft of already deceased bodies to the deliberate killing of living victims reveals not only the corrupting influence of easy money and institutional complicity, but also the devastating consequences of a society that valued medical progress over basic human dignity and legal constraint. William Burke arrived in Edinburgh sometime around 1818, having left his native Ireland in search of better economic opportunities in Scotland's rapidly expanding capital city. Burke's background was typical of many Irish immigrants of the period. He came from a rural, impoverished family and possessed few marketable skills beyond manual labor. His early years in Edinburgh were marked by financial instability and frequent changes of residence and employment, as he struggled to establish himself in a city where Irish immigrants faced significant discrimination and limited opportunities for advancement. Burke's personal life reflected the social disorganization that characterized many immigrant communities in early 19th century Edinburgh. He had abandoned his wife and children in Ireland when he emigrated, and in Edinburgh he formed a relationship with Helen MacDougall, a woman of similarly marginal social status who would later become deeply involved in his criminal activities. Their relationship was characterized by heavy drinking, frequent arguments, and periodic separations, creating an unstable domestic environment that may have contributed to Burke's eventual turn toward criminal behavior. William Hare's path to Edinburgh was similarly shaped by the economic pressures and social disruptions that drove many Irish to seek opportunities in Scotland. Hare arrived in the city somewhat earlier than Burke and had managed to establish a more stable, if still precarious, position in Edinburgh's economy. He operated a lodging house in the West Port, one of Edinburgh's most notorious slum districts, catering primarily to Irish immigrants, itinerant laborers, and others on the margins of respectable society. Hare's lodging house business placed him at the center of a community of individuals who were particularly vulnerable to exploitation and violence. His tenants included elderly pensioners, disabled individuals unable to work, and recent immigrants who lacked family connections or social support networks in Edinburgh. Many of these individuals lived from day to day, dependent on casual labor or charity for survival, and their disappearances were unlikely to attract significant attention from authorities or the broader community. The partnership between Burke and Hare began in late 1827 when Burke became a resident of Hare's lodging house along with Helen MacDougall. The two men quickly developed a relationship based on their shared Irish background, their mutual involvement in Edinburgh's marginal economy, and their common interest in alcohol and gambling. Neither man had demonstrated particular criminal tendencies prior to their association, though both had engaged in the minor infractions and occasional violence that were common among the working poor of Edinburgh. The opportunity that would launch Burke and Hare's criminal career arose in November 1827 with the natural death of Donald, an elderly army pensioner who had been residing in Hare's lodging house. Donald died owing significant rent to Hare, creating a financial problem that the lodging housekeeper was eager to resolve. The deceased man's body was scheduled for burial in a pauper's grave, but Burke suggested that they could recover Hare's losses by selling the corpse to one of Edinburgh's anatomy schools rather than allowing it to be buried. This initial venture into body selling proved remarkably easy and profitable. Burke and Hare removed Donald's body from its coffin before burial, replacing the corpse with bark to maintain the weight and appearance of the coffin during the funeral service. They then transported the body to the anatomy school operated by Dr. Robert Knox, where they received £10 for their merchandise, a sum that represented several weeks' wages for most working-class inhabitants of Edinburgh. The success of this first transaction revealed both the enormous financial incentives available in the body trade and the minimal risks associated with supplying specimens to anatomy schools. Dr. Knox asked no questions about the source of the corpse, conducted no investigation into how Burke and Hare had obtained it, and made no effort to verify that the body had been procured through legal means. This willful blindness on the part of the medical establishment would prove crucial in enabling Burke and Hare's subsequent escalation to murder. Encouraged by their initial success and motivated by the easy money available in the corpse trade, Burke and Hare began actively seeking opportunities to obtain additional bodies for sale to Dr. Knox's anatomy school. However, they quickly discovered that the conventional methods of grave robbing required skills, tools, and knowledge that they did not possess. The established resurrection men had developed sophisticated techniques for identifying suitable targets, timing their operations, and avoiding detection, advantages that Burke and Hare could not easily replicate as newcomers to the trade. The transition from grave robbing to murder appears to have occurred almost spontaneously, driven by opportunity rather than premeditation. In February 1828, another resident of Hare's lodging house, a man known only as Joseph, fell seriously ill with what appeared to be a terminal condition. Rather than waiting for Joseph to die naturally, Burke and Hare decided to accelerate his death by suffocating him with a pillow. thereby ensuring that they could deliver a fresh corpse to Dr. Knox while avoiding the technical challenges and legal risks associated with grave robbing. The method of murder that Burke and Hare employed, which became known as burking, was specifically designed to leave minimal evidence of violence while ensuring rapid death. The technique involved one perpetrator holding the victim's mouth and nose closed while the other pressed down on the chest, preventing breathing and causing death by asphyxiation. This method avoided the visible injuries associated with more conventional forms of violence, making it less likely that anatomy school customers would recognize the bodies as murder victims rather than natural deaths. The success of their second transaction convinced Burke and Hare that they had discovered an ideal criminal enterprise that combined minimal risk with maximum profit. Unlike conventional theft or robbery, which required the perpetrators to find buyers for stolen goods and face the constant threat of victim resistance or witness intervention, the murder and sale of marginal individuals seemed to offer almost unlimited opportunities with little chance of detection or punishment. Dr. Knox's continued willingness to purchase bodies from Burke and Hare without asking questions about their source provided crucial institutional support for the murderer's escalating criminal activities. Knox's anatomy school was engaged in intense competition with other medical institutions for students and reputation, and his promise of unlimited access to fresh specimens for dissection was a key element in his marketing strategy. This competitive pressure created powerful incentives for Knox to maintain steady relationships with reliable suppliers, regardless of any suspicions he might have harbored about their methods. The systematic nature of Burke and Hare's subsequent murders revealed a level of planning and organization that distinguished their crimes from acts of passion or desperation. The partners developed consistent patterns for identifying suitable victims, typically targeting individuals who were elderly, disabled, friendless, or otherwise unlikely to be missed by family members or the broader community. They showed a clear preference for victims who were strangers to Edinburgh or recent immigrants whose disappearances would not trigger intensive investigations by local authorities. Burke and Hare's victim selection process also demonstrated a calculated assessment of social vulnerability that reflected their understanding of Edinburgh's class structure and social hierarchies. They consistently avoided targeting individuals from respectable families or established social networks, focusing instead on society's most marginal members who lacked the social connections necessary to ensure that their disappearances would be noticed and investigated. This targeting strategy revealed both the murderer's cunning and the broader social indifference toward the welfare of Edinburgh's poorest residents. The methods that Burke and Hare employed to lure victims to Hare's lodging house showed increasing sophistication as their criminal enterprise developed. They typically approached potential victims in public houses, markets, or other gathering places, offering hospitality, alcohol, or temporary accommodation to individuals who appeared vulnerable and isolated. Once victims were brought to the lodging house, Burke and Hare would encourage heavy drinking to reduce their target's ability to resist attack, then murder them when other residents were absent or asleep. The disposal of victims' personal effects required careful attention to avoid creating evidence that could link Burke and Hare to their crimes. The murderers developed systematic procedures for searching bodies before delivery to anatomy schools, removing and disposing of clothing, jewelry, and other items that might be recognized by individuals who had known the victims. This attention to detail reflected their growing experience as criminals and their understanding of the investigative methods that might be employed to trace their activities. The relationship between Burke and Hare and Dr. Knox's anatomy school evolved over the course of their criminal partnership, with both sides developing increasing comfort with arrangements that all parties understood to be highly irregular, if not obviously criminal. Knox's assistants began to expect regular deliveries from Burke and Hare, setting aside space and time for the processing of their specimens, while the murderers became familiar with the school's preferences regarding the condition and preparation of bodies for educational use. The financial arrangements between Burke and Hare and Dr. Knox's school demonstrated the commercial nature of their relationship and the extent to which the anatomy school had become dependent on their criminal suppliers. Prices were negotiated based on the quality and freshness of specimens, with premium rates paid for bodies that showed minimal signs of disease or decomposition. The murderers received immediate payment in cash, allowing them to maintain their operations without the delays and complications associated with other forms of criminal enterprise. The psychological dynamics of Burke and Hare's partnership revealed the corrupting influence of easy money and the gradual erosion of moral constraints that characterized their progression from opportunistic theft to systematic murder. Initially, both men appear to have felt some hesitation about their criminal activities, but the enormous profits available in the body trade and the apparent indifference of their customers to the source of their merchandise gradually overcame these scruples. The social environment of Hare's lodging house provided ideal conditions for the concealment of Burke and Hare's criminal activities. The transient nature of the clientele meant that the disappearance of individual residents was unlikely to be noticed immediately, while the marginalized social status of most tenants meant that any concerns about missing persons were unlikely to receive serious attention from authorities. The prevalence of heavy drinking and violent behavior in the lodging house also provided ready explanations for any suspicious sounds or disturbances that might have been associated with the murders. Burke and Hare's 16 known murders, committed over the course of approximately 10 months in 1828, represented one of the most intensive killing sprees in British criminal history. The pace of their criminal activities revealed both the enormous demand for anatomical specimens in Edinburgh's medical schools and the murderers' growing confidence in their ability to kill and dispose of victims without detection. Each successful transaction reinforced their belief that they had discovered a perfect crime that combined minimal risk with maximum reward. The victims of Burke and Hare's murders represented a cross-section of Edinburgh's most vulnerable population, including elderly pensioners, disabled individuals, recent immigrants, and others who lacked the social connections necessary to ensure that their disappearances would trigger serious investigations. The systematic targeting of such individuals revealed not only the murderers' calculated cruelty, but also the broader social indifference that made their crimes possible. The eventual discovery of Burke and Hare's crimes in October 1828 resulted not from investigative work by authorities, but from the accidental observation of their activities by other residents of Hare's lodging house. This circumstance highlighted both the murderers' overconfidence after months of successful operations and the inadequacy of law enforcement mechanisms for detecting and preventing such crimes in early 19th century Edinburgh. The Burke and Hare case demonstrated how institutional complicity, social indifference, and economic incentives could combine to enable systematic criminal behavior that might otherwise have been impossible to sustain. Their progression from opportunistic grave robbing to systematic murder revealed the corrupting influence of easy profits and the devastating consequences of a system that prioritized medical education over basic human rights and legal constraints. The investigation and trial. The unraveling of Burke and Hare's murderous enterprise began with what would prove to be their final and most careless crime. On October 31, 1828, the body of Marjorie Campbell Docherty, an elderly Irish woman, was discovered under suspicious circumstances in Hare's lodging house on Tanner's Close. The discovery came about through the vigilance of fellow lodgers, James and Anne Gray, who had grown increasingly suspicious of the odd comings and goings at the establishment, particularly the frequent visits of well-dressed gentlemen who seemed to conduct their business under cover of darkness. Marjorie Docherty had arrived at the lodging house just days earlier, drawn by Burke's claim that she might be a distant relative sharing his surname. The elderly woman, originally from County Donegal, had come to Edinburgh seeking her son who had moved to the city for work. Like so many of Burke and Hare's previous victims, she represented the perfect target, alone, friendless, and unlikely to be missed by anyone of social standing. Her Irish accent and humble appearance marked her as an outsider in Edinburgh's increasingly xenophobic atmosphere, where anti-Irish sentiment ran high among the working classes who viewed the growing immigrant population as competition for scarce employment opportunities. The fatal encounter began on Halloween night, a date that would later acquire symbolic significance in the popular retelling of the story. Burke had encountered Docherty in a public house, where she was inquiring about lodgings for the night. Recognizing her vulnerability and the opportunity she presented, Burke struck up a conversation, claiming kinship through their shared surname. He invited her back to Hare's establishment, where the two men had prepared their usual routine. However, the presence of other lodgers, particularly the Gray couple, complicated their usual methods. The killing itself followed the established pattern that had served Burke and Hare so effectively throughout their year-long murder spree. The method, which would later be dubbed burking in their dubious honor, involved rendering the victim unconscious through alcohol or other means, then suffocating them by pressing down on their chest and covering their mouth and nose. This technique left few obvious marks of violence, allowing the perpetrators to present the bodies to anatomists as those of people who had died from natural causes or accidents. The method required both men to participate actively, with one typically holding down the victim while the other performed the suffocation. On this October night, however, their usual caution deserted them. The Grays, who had been staying in the same room, were hastily relocated for the evening with a flimsy excuse about needing the space for Doherty. When they returned the following morning, they found the room suspiciously clean and their host's behavior nervous and evasive. Anne Gray's persistent questioning about the whereabouts of the old woman who had been there the previous evening met with increasingly unconvincing explanations from both Burke and Hare. The discovery that would seal their fate came when Anne Gray decided to retrieve some personal belongings from under the bed in the room where Doherty had spent her final night. Her hand encountered not her possessions, but the cold flesh of a human body concealed beneath the straw mattress. The horror of the discovery was compounded by the recognition that this was indeed the elderly Irish woman who had been alive and speaking with them just hours before. The body showed no obvious signs of violence, but the circumstances of its concealment left no doubt that foul play had occurred. James Gray immediately sought out the local constabulary, but not before Burke attempted to silence the couple with bribes and threats. The offer of £10 a week for their silence revealed both the desperation of the perpetrators and the substantial profits they had been generating from their grisly trade. When bribery failed, Burke's threats grew more explicit, making it clear that the Grays could easily become the next victims if they chose to speak out. However, the couple's moral revulsion at what they had discovered overcame their fear, and they proceeded to the police with their shocking tale. The arrest of Burke and Hare, along with their female companions Helen McDougall and Margaret Hare, occurred on November 1, 1828. The Edinburgh police, led by Lieutenant John Fisher, approached the case with unusual thoroughness for the time period. The discovery of Doherty's body provided concrete evidence of murder, but investigators quickly realized they were dealing with something far more extensive than a single killing. The suspicious circumstances, the ready access to anatomical schools, and the lifestyle of the accused far exceeded what could be explained by legitimate employment. The police investigation revealed a network of relationships and financial transactions that pointed to systematic criminal activity over an extended period. Dr. Robert Knox's anatomy school at Surgeon Square became a focal point of the investigation, as records showed that Burke and Hare had been regular suppliers of cadavers, delivering bodies at unusual hours, and receiving substantial payments that far exceeded the normal rates for legitimate body procurement. The quality and freshness of the bodies they supplied had been remarkable, always arriving in excellent condition for dissection, which now took on a sinister significance. During the initial questioning, the full scope of the crimes began to emerge. Burke and Hare had been methodically targeting Edinburgh's most vulnerable residents, particularly those whose disappearance would cause minimal investigation or public outcry. Their victim selection showed a calculated understanding of social dynamics and police priorities in early 19th century Scotland. The elderly poor, Irish immigrants, disabled individuals, and prostitutes formed the majority of their targets, chosen precisely because their absence would be noted by few and mourned by fewer still. The investigation revealed that the partnership had claimed at least 16 lives over the course of approximately 1 year, though the true number may never be known. Each murder had been carefully planned and executed, with the perpetrators developing increasingly sophisticated methods for luring victims to their deaths. They had established relationships with potential victims over time, gaining their trust before striking. Burke, in particular, demonstrated a chilling ability to befriend vulnerable individuals, often maintaining contact for weeks before identifying the optimal moment for murder. The legal proceedings that followed represented one of the most sensational criminal trials in Scottish history. The case presented unique challenges for the prosecution, as most of the evidence was circumstantial, and the bodies of the victims had long since been dissected and disposed of through the anatomy schools. The prosecution team, led by Sir William Ray, the Lord Advocate, faced the daunting task of proving multiple murders when only one body remained as evidence. The breakthrough in the case came when William Hare made the calculated decision to turn King's evidence, providing testimony against his partner in exchange for immunity from prosecution. This decision reflected both the pragmatic nature of their relationship and Hare's superior position as the owner of the lodging house where most of the crimes had been committed. Hare's testimony provided the prosecution with detailed accounts of the murders, including the methods used, the victims targeted, and the disposal of the bodies through Knox's anatomy school. Hare's decision to testify against Burke created a sensation in Edinburgh and beyond. The spectacle of one murderer testifying against another captured public imagination and raised complex questions about the nature of justice and the reliability of accomplice testimony. Hare's credibility as a witness was inherently problematic, given his admitted participation in the same crimes for which Burke faced trial. However, the detailed nature of his testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and witness accounts, provided the prosecution with its strongest case. The trial of William Burke began on December 24, 1828, in the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh. The timing, just before Christmas, added to the dramatic atmosphere surrounding the proceedings. The courthouse was packed daily with spectators, including many from Edinburgh's medical community, who followed the case with particular interest given its implications for their profession. The press coverage was extensive, with newspapers throughout Britain and Ireland reporting on every detail of the testimony. Burke's defense team, led by Henry Cockburn, faced an almost impossible task. The weight of evidence against their client was overwhelming, particularly with Hare's detailed testimony providing a comprehensive account of the murders. The defense strategy focused primarily on challenging Hare's credibility and suggesting that the case against Burke was built on the unreliable testimony of an equally guilty accomplice seeking to save his own life. They argued that Hare had orchestrated the murders and was now sacrificing Burke to escape justice himself. The prosecution's case methodically established the pattern of murders, beginning with the death of Donald, Hare's lodger, in November 1827, and continuing through the final murder of Marjorie Docherty. Each killing followed a similar pattern. Vulnerable individuals were lured to Hare's lodging house, plied with alcohol, and then murdered using the suffocation technique that would become known as burking. The bodies were then sold to Dr. Knox's anatomy school for substantial sums, typically ranging from 8 to 14 pounds per body. Helen McDougall, Burke's common-law wife, faced charges as an accessory to the murders. Her trial ran concurrently with Burke's, creating additional drama as the couple faced potential execution together. McDougall's defense centered on her claimed ignorance of her partner's activities and her role as another victim of Burke's manipulation and violence. The evidence against her was less conclusive than that against Burke, consisting primarily of her presence during some of the crimes and her assistance in disposing of evidence. The public reaction to the trial was unprecedented in its intensity and scope. Crowds gathered daily outside the courthouse, and the proceedings were reported in minute detail by newspapers throughout the United Kingdom and Ireland. The case touched on deep-seated social anxieties about medical education, the treatment of the poor, and the moral boundaries of scientific advancement. Public opinion was overwhelmingly hostile to the defendants, with particular anger directed at the perceived exploitation of society's most vulnerable members. The testimony revealed the calculating nature of the murders and the cold-blooded efficiency with which Burke and Hare had operated their deadly enterprise. Witnesses described the cheerful demeanor of the accused when delivering bodies to the anatomy school, their casual discussions of their merchandise, and their apparent lack of remorse or emotional response to their crimes. This clinical detachment in the face of multiple murders struck observers as particularly chilling and reinforced public perception of the defendants as monsters rather than ordinary criminals driven by desperation. Dr. Robert Knox's role in the proceedings created additional controversy and public outrage. While not charged with any crimes, Knox's willingness to purchase bodies without questioning their source and his apparent satisfaction with the unusually fresh condition of the cadavers supplied by Burke and Hare raised serious questions about professional responsibility and willful blindness to obvious criminal activity. Knox's reputation suffered irreparable damage, and he became a figure of public hatred despite avoiding legal consequences. The trial concluded on December 25, 1828, with the jury's verdict delivered on Christmas Day. Burke was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death by hanging. Helen McDougall was acquitted due to insufficient evidence, though her release did not protect her from public hostility. The verdict was met with widespread approval from the public, who had followed the case with intense interest and had already rendered their own judgment on the defendant's guilt. Burke's execution was scheduled for January 28, 1829, and became one of the most attended public executions in Edinburgh's history. An estimated 25,000 people gathered to witness the hanging, creating a carnival-like atmosphere that reflected both the public's fascination with the crime and their satisfaction at seeing justice served. The crowd's mood was celebratory rather than somber, with many viewing Burke's death as fitting retribution for his crimes against the city's most vulnerable residents. In the days leading up to his execution, Burke provided a detailed confession that corroborated much of Hare's testimony and provided additional details about their methods and victims. This confession, published in pamphlet form after his death, became a bestseller and further inflamed public opinion against his surviving accomplices. Burke's apparent remorse in his final days was viewed skeptically by a public that had been horrified by the calculated nature of his crimes. The aftermath of the trial created lasting consequences for all the surviving participants. William Hare, despite his immunity from prosecution, found his life in Edinburgh untenable due to public hostility. Attempts were made on his life, and he was forced to flee the city under police protection. His ultimate fate remains uncertain, with various unconfirmed reports placing him in different parts of Britain and Ireland in subsequent years. The price of his survival was permanent exile and the constant fear of recognition and retribution. Helen McDougall's acquittal provided little protection from public anger. She too was forced to leave Edinburgh, facing threats and harassment wherever her identity became known. Her association with Burke made her a target of continuing public hatred, and she spent her remaining years in obscurity and poverty, a living reminder of the crimes that had shocked the nation. Dr. Robert Knox faced the most complex aftermath of all the surviving figures. While avoiding criminal charges, his career and reputation were effectively destroyed by his association with the case. The medical establishment largely abandoned him, students boycotted his lectures, and his practice dwindled as public opinion turned decisively against him. Knox maintained his innocence of any wrongdoing, claiming he had been a victim of Burke and Hare's deception, but public opinion remained unconvinced. The trial and its aftermath marked a turning point in public awareness of the medical profession's practices and the ethical boundaries of scientific education. The revelation that respected medical institutions had been willing purchasers of murdered victims' bodies created a crisis of confidence in the medical establishment that would have lasting implications for medical education and regulation. Broader impact and analysis. The Burke and Hare murders created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate criminal justice response, fundamentally altering medical education, social policy, and public discourse throughout Britain. The case exposed deep-seated problems in the intersection of medical advancement, social inequality, and legal frameworks that had developed over decades of inadequate regulation and willful blindness to questionable practices within the medical establishment. Medical education reform became the most immediate and tangible result of the public outcry generated by the Burke and Hare revelations. The existing legal framework, based primarily on the Murder Act of 1752, had proven completely inadequate to meet the growing demands of medical schools for anatomical subjects. This law permitted only the bodies of executed criminals to be used for dissection, but the number of executions had declined significantly throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries as legal reforms reduced the number of capital offenses. Simultaneously, the number of medical students and the sophistication of anatomical education had increased dramatically, creating an impossible mismatch between legal supply and educational demand. The Anatomy Act of 1832 represented Parliament's comprehensive response to this crisis, fundamentally restructuring the legal framework governing the procurement of bodies for medical education. This legislation established a regulated system whereby bodies of individuals who died in workhouses, hospitals, and other public institutions could be used for anatomical purposes if not claimed by relatives within a specified time period. The Act created a licensing system for anatomy schools, imposed strict record-keeping requirements, and established oversight mechanisms to prevent the abuses that had enabled Burke and Hare's criminal enterprise. The implementation of the Anatomy Act marked a significant shift in the relationship between medical education and the state. For the first time, the government formally recognized medical education as a legitimate public interest requiring legal support and protection, while simultaneously acknowledging the need for strict regulation to prevent exploitation and abuse. The Act's provisions reflected a careful balance between supporting medical advancement and protecting individual dignity and social stability. However, the Act also institutionalized class-based discrimination in death, as it primarily affected the bodies of the poor who died in public institutions. Wealthy individuals who died in their own homes remained protected from dissection, while the destitute faced the prospect of their bodies being used for medical education, regardless of their personal wishes or religious beliefs. This aspect of the legislation reflected and reinforced existing social hierarchies, ensuring that medical advancement continued to be built upon the bodies of society's most vulnerable members. The long-term changes in medical training extended beyond simple legal reform to encompass fundamental shifts in professional ethics and educational methodology. Medical schools were forced to confront the moral implications of their previous willingness to accept bodies from questionable sources without adequate investigation. The Burke and Hare case had revealed a culture of willful ignorance within the medical establishment, where the obvious signs of foul play were overlooked in favor of maintaining adequate supplies of fresh cadavers. Professional medical education began incorporating explicit ethical training and discussions of the moral responsibilities of physicians. The concept of informed consent, while not yet fully developed, began to emerge as medical educators grappled with questions about the rights of patients and research subjects. The case contributed to broader discussions about the relationship between medical advancement and individual autonomy that would continue to evolve throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. The social and cultural impact of the Burke and Hare murders extended far beyond medical education reform, fundamentally altering public perceptions of medical professionals and scientific advancement. The revelation that respected members of the medical establishment had been willing purchasers of murder victims' bodies created a crisis of trust that took decades to overcome. The public began to view medical professionals with suspicion and skepticism, questioning their motives and methods in ways that had previously been unthinkable. Public awareness of medical education practices increased dramatically as newspapers and pamphlets disseminated detailed accounts of the crimes and the medical establishment's role in enabling them. For the first time, ordinary citizens gained insight into the previously secretive world of medical education, learning about dissection practices, anatomical research, and the commercial aspects of medical training. This knowledge created both fascination and revulsion, as the public struggled to reconcile their respect for medical advancement with their horror at the methods used to achieve it. Class consciousness and social justice issues became central themes in public discourse about the case. The systematic targeting of society's most vulnerable members, the elderly, the poor, Irish immigrants, and the disabled, highlighted the extreme inequalities that characterized early 19th century society. Burke and Hare's victim selection revealed a calculated understanding of social hierarchies, as they correctly predicted that the disappearance of marginalized individuals would generate minimal investigation or public concern. The case became a symbol of class-based exploitation and violence, with reformers using it to illustrate the need for better social protections and more equitable treatment of the poor. The fact that wealthy medical students and professors had benefited from the murders of destitute victims created a powerful narrative of exploitation that resonated with working-class audiences and social reformers throughout Britain and Ireland. Religious and ethical debates surrounding the case reflected broader tensions about the relationship between scientific advancement and traditional moral frameworks. The Christian churches, particularly in Scotland, had long opposed anatomical dissection on theological grounds, viewing it as a violation of bodily integrity that could interfere with resurrection. The Burke and Hare murders provided religious leaders with powerful ammunition for their arguments against dissection, as they could point to concrete examples of how medical education had literally led to murder. However, the case also forced religious institutions to grapple with more complex questions about the balance between opposing evil and supporting beneficial scientific advancement. Some religious leaders began to acknowledge that properly regulated anatomical education could serve legitimate purposes while still condemning the criminal methods that had been employed. This nuanced approach contributed to the eventual acceptance of the Anatomy Act's provisions, even among religious communities that had previously opposed all forms of dissection. The development of popular culture and folklore surrounding Burke and Hare reflected the deep impact the case had on public consciousness. Within months of Burke's execution, songs, poems, plays, and stories about the murders began circulating throughout Britain and Ireland. These popular cultural productions served multiple functions. They provided entertainment, moral instruction, and a means of processing the horror and implications of the crimes. The folklore that developed around the case often emphasized themes of justice, retribution, and the protection of the innocent. Burke and Hare became archetypal villains in popular culture, representing the dangers of unchecked greed and the exploitation of the vulnerable. Their story became a cautionary tale about the moral boundaries of scientific advancement and the importance of maintaining ethical standards, even in pursuit of knowledge and progress. The criminal justice implications of the Burke and Hare case extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings to influence long-term developments in murder investigation techniques and legal precedents. The case represented one of the first instances where police investigators attempted to reconstruct a pattern of serial killings using circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. The investigation required new approaches to evidence gathering and analysis that would influence detective work for generations. The evolution of murder investigation techniques accelerated as a result of the challenges presented by the Burke and Hare case. The absence of obvious signs of violence in their victims required investigators to look beyond traditional physical evidence to understand the crimes. This led to greater emphasis on motive analysis, pattern recognition, and the systematic collection of witness testimony. The case contributed to the development of more sophisticated approaches to criminal investigation that would eventually evolve into modern forensic science. Legal precedents established during the Burke and Hare trial had lasting implications for the use of accomplice testimony in criminal proceedings. Hare's decision to testify against Burke in exchange for immunity created important precedents for plea bargaining and the use of co-conspirator testimony in complex criminal cases. The courts had to grapple with questions about the reliability and admissibility of testimony from individuals who were equally culpable in the crimes they were describing. The public execution of Burke represented one of the last great spectacles of public justice in Edinburgh, drawing enormous crowds who viewed the hanging as both entertainment and moral instruction. The carnival-like atmosphere surrounding the execution reflected contemporary attitudes toward public punishment and its role in maintaining social order. However, the case also contributed to growing debates about the effectiveness and morality of public executions that would eventually lead to their abolition. Crime prevention and deterrence discussions following the Burke and Hare case focused on the social conditions that had enabled the murders to occur. Reformers argued that addressing poverty, social exclusion, and the vulnerability of marginalized populations would be more effective than relying solely on punishment to prevent similar crimes. The case became part of broader debates about social reform and the government's responsibility to protect all citizens, regardless of their social status. The Burke and Hare murders also highlighted the importance of community vigilance and social solidarity in preventing crime. The role of James and Anne Gray in discovering and reporting the final murder demonstrated how ordinary citizens could serve as protectors of their community's most vulnerable members. This aspect of the case was emphasized in contemporary discussions about civic responsibility and social cohesion. Comparative analysis, international context. The Burke and Hare murders, while shocking in their scope and systematic nature, were part of a broader international phenomenon of body snatching and anatomical crime that characterized the development of medical education throughout the Western world during the 18th and 19th centuries. Understanding the Edinburgh murders within this global context reveals both the unique aspects of the Scottish case and the universal challenges faced by emerging medical institutions in their quest for anatomical knowledge. Similar cases in other countries demonstrated that the conflict between medical education needs and legal restrictions on body procurement was not unique to Scotland. In colonial and early Republican America, grave robbing had been a persistent problem since the establishment of the first medical schools in the mid-18th century. The colonies and later states faced the same fundamental challenge as Scotland. Growing medical institutions required increasing numbers of cadavers for anatomical instruction, but legal and social restrictions severely limited the legitimate supply of bodies available for dissection. American medical schools, particularly those in major cities like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston, developed their own networks of professional grave robbers known as resurrectionists or sack-em-up men. These individuals operated in much the same way as their Scottish counterparts, systematically targeting recently buried bodies in cemeteries throughout urban areas. The American body snatching trade was similarly organized and commercially oriented, with established pricing structures and regular business relationships between grave robbers and medical institutions. However, the American context differed significantly from the Scottish situation in several important respects. The federal structure of American government meant that regulations regarding anatomical education varied significantly between states, creating opportunities for cross-border body trafficking that did not exist within Scotland's unified legal system. Medical schools in states with restrictive anatomy laws could import cadavers from jurisdictions with more permissive regulations, creating a complex interstate commerce in human remains. The American cases also reflected different social dynamics, particularly regarding race and class. In the antebellum South, the bodies of enslaved African Americans were frequently used for anatomical education without any legal protections or consent requirements. This practice created a systematic exploitation of enslaved people that extended beyond life into death, as their bodies became commodities for medical education in ways that white bodies were protected from by law and social custom. The most notorious American case paralleling Burke and Hare occurred in Philadelphia in the 1840s, involving a network of grave robbers who eventually turned to murder when legitimate body snatching became too difficult. However, the American murders were less systematic than the Edinburgh crimes and generated less sustained public attention, partly due to the more dispersed nature of American media and the federal structure that limited the scope of legal reforms. European practices and regulations regarding anatomical education varied considerably across different national and regional contexts, reflecting diverse legal traditions, religious influences, and social structures. In France, the revolutionary period had brought significant changes to anatomical education, with the new Republican government showing greater willingness to support medical education through legal reforms. The French system provided more legitimate access to bodies for anatomical purposes, reducing the incentives for criminal activity that characterized the British and American situations. German states presented a complex patchwork of regulations and practices, with some principalities providing relatively liberal access to bodies for medical education, while others maintained strict restrictions based on religious or traditional grounds. The fragmented nature of German political authority created opportunities for medical schools to locate in jurisdictions with favorable regulations, leading to concentrations of anatomical education in particular cities and regions. Italian medical education faced unique challenges due to the strong influence of the Catholic Church, which maintained theological objections to anatomical dissection while simultaneously supporting the advancement of medical knowledge. This tension created complex negotiations between medical institutions and religious authorities that sometimes resulted in compromise arrangements allowing limited anatomical education under strict religious supervision. Colonial medical education challenges in various parts of the expanding British Empire created additional context for understanding the body procurement crisis. In India, British medical schools faced the challenge of training both European and Indian physicians while navigating complex cultural and religious sensitivities regarding the treatment of human remains. Different religious traditions within Indian society had varying attitudes toward bodily integrity after death, creating complex negotiations about the sources and methods for obtaining anatomical subjects. Similar challenges arose in other colonial contexts, where European medical institutions had to adapt their practices to local cultural conditions, while maintaining educational standards comparable to those in metropolitan centers. These adaptations sometimes created innovative solutions to body procurement problems, but they also raise complex questions about cultural imperialism and the imposition of European medical practices on indigenous populations. Cross-cultural attitudes toward dissection revealed fundamental differences in religious and philosophical approaches to death, bodily integrity, and scientific advancement. While Christian traditions generally opposed anatomical dissection on theological grounds, other religious systems had different perspectives that sometimes proved more accommodating to medical education needs. Understanding these cultural variations helps illuminate why body procurement crises develop differently in various national and colonial contexts. The economic and social factors underlying body procurement problems were remarkably consistent across different national contexts, despite variations in legal and cultural frameworks. Poverty and social vulnerability consistently determined who became victims of body snatching and anatomical crimes, regardless of the specific national or regional context. The poor, ethnic minorities, recent immigrants, and other marginalized populations bore disproportionate risks in all societies where body procurement problems existed. Medical profession complicity and responsibility represented another consistent theme across international contexts. Medical educators and practicing physicians in various countries demonstrated similar patterns of willful ignorance regarding the sources of their anatomical subjects, prioritizing educational and research needs over ethical concerns about procurement methods. This professional complicity enabled criminal networks in multiple national contexts and contributed to public distrust of medical institutions throughout the Western world. The Burke and Hare murders occupy a unique position in the annals of criminal history, representing perhaps the most systematic and commercially motivated series of killings in British experience prior to the 20th century. Unlike other notorious criminals of their era, whose crimes were typically driven by passion, revenge, or conventional material gain, Burke and Hare operated as entrepreneurs in a grotesque marketplace that treated human life as a commodity to be harvested and sold. This commercial approach to murder established precedents that would later be recognized in various forms of organized crime, human trafficking, and other enterprises that reduce human beings to economic units. The psychological dimensions of the Burke and Hare case have attracted sustained attention from criminologists, psychiatrists, and behavioral scientists seeking to understand how ordinary individuals can become capable of systematic killing. Neither Burke nor Hare demonstrated obvious signs of mental illness or psychopathic personality traits that might explain their capacity for repeated murder. Instead, their crimes appear to have resulted from a gradual process of moral degradation facilitated by economic incentives, social isolation, and institutional complicity. This pattern of incremental ethical erosion has become a subject of particular interest in studies of white-collar crime, corporate malfeasance, and other forms of institutionally supported wrongdoing. The role of institutional complicity in enabling Burke and Hare's crimes has emerged as one of the most significant aspects of their legacy for modern ethical analysis. Dr. Robert Knox and other members of Edinburgh's medical establishment were not merely passive recipients of stolen goods, but active participants in a system that created powerful incentives for criminal behavior, while maintaining elaborate fictions of ignorance about the sources of their anatomical specimens. This pattern of willful blindness, institutional pressure, and moral compartmentalization has been recognized in numerous contemporary contexts, from corporate environmental violations to military contractors' use of child labor in conflict zones. Modern medical ethics education routinely employs the Burke and Hare case as a cautionary example of how the pursuit of scientific knowledge can become divorced from fundamental moral principles. Medical students learn about the murders as part of broader discussions about informed consent, the treatment of vulnerable populations, and the responsibilities of healthcare professionals to ensure that their work does not contribute to exploitation or abuse. The case serves as a powerful reminder that medical progress achieved through morally compromised means ultimately undermines the very humanitarian principles that should guide healthcare practice. The Burke and Hare murders also established important precedents in the development of forensic science and criminal investigation techniques. The investigation of their crimes represented one of the earliest examples of systematic evidence collection, witness coordination, and prosecutorial strategy in a complex murder case. The legal proceedings that followed their arrest introduced innovative approaches to accomplice testimony, circumstantial evidence, and public prosecution that would influence criminal justice practices throughout the British Empire and beyond. Contemporary discussions of organ trafficking, medical tourism, and exploitative research practices in developing countries frequently reference the Burke and Hare case as a historical parallel. The fundamental dynamic identified in Edinburgh, wealthy institutions creating demand for human biological materials that are supplied through the exploitation of vulnerable populations, remains tragically relevant in modern contexts. International health organizations regularly encounter situations where poverty, social marginalization, and inadequate legal protection create conditions similar to those that enabled Burke and Hare's criminal enterprise. The social justice implications of the Burke and Hare case have gained renewed attention in recent decades as scholars have examined how class, ethnicity, and social vulnerability influence both the selection of victims and the response of authorities. The systematic targeting of Irish immigrants, elderly pensioners, and disabled individuals reflected broader patterns of social discrimination that made certain populations particularly susceptible to exploitation and violence. This analysis has informed contemporary discussions about hate crimes, targeted violence against vulnerable groups, and the responsibility of institutions to protect marginalized populations. The transformation of the Burke and Hare story into popular entertainment and cultural mythology represents another significant dimension of their modern legacy. Their crimes have been the subject of numerous films, television programs, novels, and theatrical productions, many of which have substantially distorted the historical facts in favor of sensationalism or romantic fantasy. This commercialization of their murders has created ethical dilemmas about the appropriate treatment of historical atrocities and the responsibility of entertainment media to respect the memory of victims while satisfying public demand for compelling narratives. Edinburgh's tourism industry has embraced the Burke and Hare story as part of the city's dark heritage, offering walking tours, museum exhibits, and other attractions that capitalize on the historical association with murder and body snatching. This commercialization has generated controversy about whether such activities constitute appropriate historical education or exploitative entertainment that trivializes serious crimes. The debate reflects broader tensions between historical preservation, economic development, and ethical responsibility in the presentation of traumatic historical events. The legal precedents established during Burke's trial continue to influence contemporary criminal justice practice, particularly in cases involving accomplice testimony and circumstantial evidence. Hare's decision to testify against his partner in exchange for immunity established important principles about prosecutorial discretion, plea bargaining, and the use of criminal informants that remain central to modern legal systems. The case also demonstrated the challenges of prosecuting complex criminal enterprises where direct evidence of individual crimes may be limited, but patterns of behavior suggest systematic wrongdoing. Modern human rights organizations have identified the Burke and Hare case as an early example of crimes that would now be classified as crimes against humanity, given their systematic nature, the vulnerability of the victims, and the institutional support that enabled their continuation. This classification has informed discussions about transitional justice, historical accountability, and the responsibility of professional institutions to acknowledge and address past complicity in human rights violations. The psychological trauma experienced by the Edinburgh community following the discovery of Burke and Hare's crimes has been studied as an early example of collective trauma and social healing processes. The public's reaction to the murders revealed deep anxieties about social trust, institutional reliability, and personal safety that required sustained community effort to address. These dynamics have been recognized in contemporary responses to mass violence, institutional abuse scandals, and other events that undermine fundamental assumptions about social order and protection. Educational institutions worldwide now use the Burke and Hare case as a teaching tool across multiple disciplines, from medical ethics and criminal justice to sociology and public policy. The case provides a compelling example of how individual criminal behavior intersects with broader social structures, economic systems, and institutional practices to create conditions for systematic abuse. This interdisciplinary approach to understanding crime has influenced modern approaches to prevention, intervention, and justice that emphasize systemic rather than purely individual factors. The technological parallels between the body-snatching trade of the 19th century and contemporary forms of human exploitation have become increasingly apparent as global communication and transportation systems facilitate new forms of trafficking and exploitation. The organizational structures, commercial relationships, and regulatory gaps that enabled Burke and Hare's enterprise bear striking resemblances to modern networks involved in organ trafficking, forced labor, and other forms of human commodification. Contemporary bioethics discussions frequently invoke the Burke and Hare case when examining issues related to research with vulnerable populations, international clinical trials, and the commodification of human biological materials. The fundamental questions raised by their crimes about consent, exploitation, institutional responsibility, and the limits of acceptable risk in pursuit of medical knowledge remain central to modern debates about research ethics and healthcare justice. The Burke and Hare legacy has also influenced modern approaches to memorial and commemoration of crime victims, particularly those from marginalized communities whose deaths might otherwise be forgotten or trivialized. Efforts to identify and honor the victims of Burke and Hare's murders have established precedents for victim advocacy, historical justice, and community healing that continue to inform responses to mass violence and systematic abuse in contemporary contexts. The enduring relevance of the Burke and Hare case ultimately lies not in the specific details of their crimes, but in the broader patterns of institutional failure, social vulnerability, and moral compromise that their story illuminates. Their murders serve as a permanent reminder that scientific progress, economic development, and professional advancement must be pursued within ethical frameworks that prioritize human dignity and social justice. The continued study and discussion of their crimes represents both an acknowledgement of historical injustice and a commitment to preventing similar atrocities in contemporary contexts where new technologies, global markets, and complex institutions create both unprecedented opportunities for human flourishing and novel possibilities for exploitation and abuse. Research questions and analytical framework. The Burke and Hare case presents a complex web of social, economic, and institutional factors that demand rigorous analytical examination. Understanding how socioeconomic conditions contributed to the flourishing body-snatching trade requires us to examine the intersection of poverty, medical advancement, and social stratification in early 19th century Edinburgh. The victims of Burke and Hare were overwhelmingly drawn from society's most vulnerable populations: elderly pensioners, disabled individuals, Irish immigrants, and those experiencing homelessness or destitution. This pattern was not coincidental, but reflected deliberate targeting strategies that exploited existing social inequalities and marginalization. The economic desperation that drove many into the body-snatching profession cannot be understood in isolation from broader socioeconomic conditions. Edinburgh in the 1820s experienced significant urban growth, industrial development, and accompanying social displacement. Traditional support systems were breaking down while new forms of poverty emerged. The Irish immigrant community, from which several victims were drawn, faced particular discrimination and economic exclusion. These individuals often lived in overcrowded lodging houses, worked in precarious employment, and lacked the social connections that might have provided protection or advocacy when they disappeared. The medical profession's complicity in perpetuating these crimes raises fundamental questions about institutional responsibility and ethical boundaries. Dr. Robert Knox, who purchased the majority of Burke and Hare's victims, operated within a system that deliberately maintained willful ignorance about the source of anatomical specimens. This institutional blind spot was not accidental, but represented a calculated decision to prioritize medical education advancement over moral considerations. The question of how much medical professionals knew or suspected about the origins of their specimens remains contentious, but evidence suggests that the rapid supply of fresh, unmarked bodies should have raised immediate suspicions. Examining the role of institutional complicity reveals how established systems can become corrupted when economic incentives align with moral compromises. Medical schools created demand for fresh corpses, but deliberately avoided establishing oversight mechanisms that might have prevented criminal activity. This willful negligence extended beyond individual actors to encompass entire institutional structures that benefited from criminal activity while maintaining plausible deniability. The competitive nature of medical education, where schools vied for students and reputation based partly on their access to anatomical specimens, created perverse incentives that encouraged looking the other way when convenient supplies appeared. The catalyst effect of the Burke and Hare case on medical education reform demonstrates how public scandals can drive institutional change when other mechanisms fail. The widespread public outrage following the trials created political pressure that had been absent despite years of known problems with body procurement. This suggests that reform often requires not just awareness of problems, but also sufficient public attention and political will to overcome entrenched interests. The Anatomy Act of 1832 represented a comprehensive response that addressed both supply issues and oversight mechanisms, but its passage required the dramatic exposure of criminal activity to overcome professional resistance. Understanding the long-term societal impacts requires examining how the case influenced public attitudes toward medical authority, criminal justice, and social protection for vulnerable populations. The Burke and Hare murders exposed the extent to which medical advancement had proceeded without adequate ethical constraints or public oversight. This revelation contributed to broader discussions about professional accountability and the limits of scientific pursuit. The case also highlighted systematic failures in social support systems that left vulnerable individuals without protection or advocacy. From a historical criminology perspective, Burke and Hare represent an evolution in criminal methodology that reflected changing social and economic conditions. Unlike traditional grave robbing, which required physical labor and carried risks of discovery, murder provided a more efficient means of supplying fresh specimens. This transition illustrates how criminal enterprises adapt to market demands and opportunities. The partnership between Burke and Hare also demonstrates how criminal networks can develop specialization and division of labor to maximize efficiency and minimize individual risk. Medical sociology analysis reveals how professional communities can develop ethical blind spots when faced with competing pressures and incentives. The medical profession in Edinburgh had legitimate educational needs that were poorly served by existing legal frameworks. However, rather than advocating for systematic reform, many practitioners chose to work within illegal markets while maintaining professional respectability. This dual existence required elaborate justification mechanisms and institutional structures that separated official policy from actual practice. Economic history examination shows how market forces operated within illegal body trade networks. Prices for fresh specimens reflected supply and demand dynamics, with premium payments for recently deceased individuals in good condition. This market operated with remarkable efficiency, suggesting sophisticated distribution networks and quality assessment mechanisms. The transition from grave robbing to murder represented a rational economic response to changing market conditions and supply constraints. Social justice and class analysis illuminate how victim selection reflected existing power structures and social hierarchies. Burke and Hare did not randomly select victims, but systematically targeted individuals whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation or public concern. This pattern reveals how criminal enterprises can exploit existing social inequalities to minimize their operational risks. The fact that 16 murders could occur over nearly a year without generating significant official attention demonstrates how effectively criminals could operate within existing social blind spots. Gender and vulnerability studies provide additional analytical frameworks for understanding victim selection and criminal methodology. Several victims were elderly women living alone, individuals whose social isolation made them both easy targets and unlikely to be quickly missed. The case also reveals how gender intersected with other vulnerability factors, such as age, disability, and immigrant status, to create particular risks. Understanding these intersections helps explain why certain individuals became victims while others in similar circumstances did not. The analytical framework must also consider how historical trauma and memory function in shaping contemporary understanding of these events. The Burke and Hare case has become embedded in popular culture and collective memory in ways that sometimes obscure historical complexity. Tourist attractions, fictional adaptations, and folklore have created particular narratives that may not align with historical evidence. Understanding how these popular interpretations developed and persist provides insights into how societies process and commemorate traumatic historical events. Comparative analysis with similar cases reveals both universal patterns and unique contextual factors. Body snatching was not unique to Edinburgh, but occurred wherever medical education developed without adequate legal supply mechanisms. However, the specific evolution from grave robbing to systematic murder appears to have been relatively rare, making Burke and Hare an exceptional rather than representative case. This exceptionality raises questions about what specific factors enabled their particular criminal enterprise to develop and persist. Research questions must also address methodological challenges in studying historical criminal cases. Evidence from the period is incomplete and potentially biased by the legal and social context in which it was produced. Court records reflect prosecution strategies rather than comprehensive historical documentation. Newspaper accounts were influenced by contemporary social attitudes and sensational journalism practices. These source limitations require careful analytical approaches that acknowledge uncertainty while drawing reasonable conclusions from available evidence. The framework must also consider how contemporary concerns influence historical interpretation. Modern discussions about medical ethics, organ trafficking, and exploitation of vulnerable populations inevitably shape how we understand historical cases. While these contemporary perspectives can provide valuable analytical tools, they must be balanced against historical context and period-specific understanding. The challenge lies in maintaining analytical rigor while acknowledging how present concerns influence historical interpretation. Sources and methodology. The documentary record surrounding Burke and Hare provides remarkably rich primary source material, though like all historical evidence, it requires careful interpretation and contextual analysis. Court records and trial transcripts form the foundational primary sources for understanding the legal proceedings and official responses to the murders. The trial of William Burke in December 1828 generated extensive documentation, including witness testimonies, legal arguments, and procedural records. These materials provide detailed accounts of the murders, the investigation process, and the legal strategies employed by both prosecution and defense. However, trial records must be understood within their legal context, as they reflect the specific requirements of criminal prosecution rather than comprehensive historical documentation. Burke's confession, delivered shortly before his execution in January 1829, provides unique insight into the criminal partnership and methodology. This document offers first-hand account of the murders, though it must be evaluated considering Burke's circumstances and potential motivations for selective disclosure. The confession reveals details about victim selection, killing methods, and the relationship with Dr. Knox that were not fully explored during the trial. However, Burke's account also serves particular purposes, including attempts to minimize Hare's role and deflect responsibility from other potential accomplices. Contemporary newspaper accounts provide crucial documentation of public reaction and social context surrounding the case. Edinburgh newspapers covered the story extensively, from initial arrest through trial proceedings and execution. These accounts capture contemporary social attitudes, public outrage, and political responses to the murders. The Scotsman, Edinburgh Evening Current, and Caledonian Mercury provided detailed coverage that reveals how different social groups understood and responded to the events. However, newspaper accounts must be analyzed considering contemporary journalism practices, political affiliations, and sensational reporting tendencies. Medical school records and correspondence offer insights into institutional practices and responses to the scandal. The University of Edinburgh Medical School maintained records of anatomical instruction, student enrollment, and administrative decisions related to specimen procurement. Private correspondence between medical professors provides evidence of professional attitudes toward body procurement and responses to public criticism. Dr. Knox's papers, though partially destroyed, contain materials that illuminate the relationship between medical education and illegal body trade. Government reports and legislative materials document official responses and reform efforts following the Burke and Hare revelations. Parliamentary debates surrounding the Anatomy Act of 1832 provide detailed discussion of policy issues and competing perspectives on medical education reform. Select committee reports examine the state of anatomical instruction and legal framework governing body procurement. These materials reveal how political leaders understood the problems and developed solutions, though they also reflect particular political interests and compromises. Personal accounts and memoirs from contemporary figures provide additional perspectives on the events and their impact. Medical students, legal professionals, and Edinburgh residents left written accounts of their experiences and observations. These materials offer insights into daily life, social attitudes, and long-term consequences that may not appear in official records. However, personal accounts are influenced by individual perspectives, selective memory, and retrospective interpretation of events. Methodological approaches to these primary sources require careful attention to issues of reliability, bias, and contextual interpretation. Legal documents prioritize particular types of evidence and exclude information deemed legally irrelevant. Newspaper accounts reflect contemporary social attitudes that may distort factual reporting. Personal memoirs are influenced by individual perspectives in the passage of time. Effective methodology requires triangulation between different source types while acknowledging their respective limitations and biases. Secondary sources provide crucial analytical framework and comparative context for interpreting primary materials. Historical analyses and biographies of key figures offer detailed examination of events and their significance. Notable works include Helen Macdonald's comprehensive study of Burke and Hare, which provides meticulous research into primary sources and contemporary context. Ruth Richardson's analysis of the anatomy trade places the Edinburgh murders within broader patterns of body procurement and medical education development. Medical history scholarship provides essential context for understanding the institutional environment in which Burke and Hare operated. Studies of anatomical education development, medical school organization, and professional culture illuminate the conditions that enabled criminal activity. Research into the history of dissection, cadaver procurement, and medical ethics reveals how professional attitudes evolved over time. This scholarship helps explain why medical institutions responded as they did, and how reforms developed following public exposure of criminal activity. Criminological studies offer analytical frameworks for understanding Burke and Hare within broader patterns of criminal behavior and social response. Research into serial killing, partnership crimes, and victim selection provides theoretical context for interpreting their methodology and motivations. Studies of historical crime waves and public responses help explain the social dynamics surrounding the case. This analytical approach reveals patterns that might not be apparent from purely historical examination. Social history perspectives illuminate the broader context of poverty, urbanization, and social stratification that shape both criminal opportunity and victim vulnerability. Research into Edinburgh's demographic development, economic conditions, and social structures reveals why particular populations became targets for criminal exploitation. Studies of Irish immigration, urban poverty, and social support systems explain the conditions that made certain individuals vulnerable while others remained protected. Popular culture representations provide insights into how the Burke and Hare case has been remembered and interpreted over time. Literary works, theatrical productions, films, and tourism materials reveal how different generations have understood and commemorated these events. While these representations may not align with historical evidence, they demonstrate how traumatic historical events become embedded in collective memory and cultural imagination. Methodological challenges in studying historical criminal cases require careful attention to evidence limitations and interpretive problems. The documentary record is incomplete, with many potential sources lost or destroyed over time. Surviving materials reflect particular perspectives and interests that may not represent comprehensive understanding of events. Legal proceedings focus on establishing guilt or innocence rather than providing complete historical documentation. Media coverage reflects contemporary social attitudes and reporting practices that may distort factual information. Source evaluation requires understanding contemporary context and potential biases affecting document creation and preservation. Legal records serve prosecution purposes rather than historical documentation. Medical institution records may have been selectively preserved or destroyed to protect institutional reputation. Personal accounts are influenced by individual perspectives, social position, and retrospective interpretation. Government documents reflect particular political interests and policy objectives rather than comprehensive analysis. Comparative methodology involves examining similar cases in contemporary conditions to provide context for understanding Burke and Hare's exceptional characteristics. Research into body snatching in other locations reveals common patterns and unique features of the Edinburgh case. Comparative analysis of medical education development helps explain why particular criminal enterprises emerged in specific contexts. This approach illuminates both universal patterns and unique factors that contributed to the specific criminal partnership. Interdisciplinary methodology combines historical research with insights from criminology, sociology, medical ethics, and other fields to provide comprehensive analysis. Historical evidence alone cannot fully explain the complex social, economic, and institutional factors that enabled Burke and Hare's criminal enterprise. Criminological theory helps explain criminal behavior patterns and victim selection strategies. Sociological analysis illuminates how social structures and inequalities created vulnerability and opportunity. Medical ethics provides framework for understanding professional responsibilities and institutional failures. Digital humanities approaches offer new possibilities for analyzing historical sources and patterns. Database compilation of victim information, timeline analysis, and geographic mapping can reveal patterns that might not be apparent from traditional research methods. Text analysis of contemporary documents can identify language patterns and attitude changes over time. These technological tools supplement rather than replace traditional historical methodology, but provide additional analytical capabilities. The methodology must also address ethical considerations in studying historical trauma and victimization. Research into Burke and Hare's crimes necessarily involves examining the suffering of murder victims and their families. Contemporary descendants of victims, perpetrators, and other involved parties may have legitimate interests in how these events are researched, interpreted, and presented. Ethical research practice requires sensitivity to these concerns while maintaining analytical rigor and historical accuracy. Conclusion. Framework. The intersection of medical progress and criminal activity revealed by the Burke and Hare case illuminates fundamental tensions between scientific advancement and ethical constraints that continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of medical practice and research. The Edinburgh murders demonstrate how legitimate educational needs, when combined with inadequate legal frameworks and institutional oversight, can create conditions that enable and incentivize criminal behavior. This dynamic extends beyond historical curiosity to inform ongoing debates about medical research ethics, organ procurement, and the responsibilities of professional institutions in preventing exploitation of vulnerable populations. The systematic nature of Burke and Hare's victim selection reveals how criminal enterprises can exploit existing social inequalities and institutional blind spots to minimize operational risks while maximizing profits. Their targeting of elderly, disabled, poor, and immigrant individuals was not random, but reflected calculated assessment of whose disappearance would generate minimal investigation or public concern. This pattern demonstrates how criminal activity often follows lines of social vulnerability and institutional neglect, exploiting gaps in social protection systems that leave certain populations without adequate advocacy or support. The medical profession's response to the Burke and Hare revelations illustrates how professional communities navigate between acknowledging institutional failures and protecting professional reputation and authority. Dr. Knox's fate, while damaging to his career, fell short of legal accountability and demonstrated the profession's capacity to absorb scandal while maintaining overall institutional legitimacy. The relatively limited consequences for medical professionals involved in the illegal body trade suggest that professional self-regulation mechanisms were inadequate to address systematic ethical failures when economic incentives encouraged looking away from obvious problems. The reform process that followed the Burke and Hare case provides insights into how institutional change occurs following public scandal and political pressure. The Anatomy Act of 1832 represented comprehensive reform that addressed both supply issues and oversight mechanisms, but its passage required dramatic public exposure of criminal activity to overcome professional resistance and political inertia. This pattern suggests that incremental reform efforts may be insufficient to address systematic problems when entrenched interests benefit from existing arrangements, even when those arrangements enable criminal activity. Social inequality and victimization patterns revealed by the Burke and Hare case demonstrate how criminal exploitation often follows existing lines of social vulnerability and marginalization. The victims were overwhelmingly drawn from populations that lacked social capital, political representation, and institutional protection. Their deaths generated limited immediate investigation or public concern because their lives were already marginalized within existing social structures. This pattern reveals how criminal enterprises can operate with reduced risk by targeting individuals whose exploitation generates minimal social response. The institutional responsibility and reform implications of the Burke and Hare case extend beyond medical education to broader questions about professional accountability and public oversight of specialized institutions. Medical schools created demand for anatomical specimens while deliberately maintaining ignorance about procurement methods, demonstrating how institutions can benefit from criminal activity while maintaining plausible deniability. This systematic avoidance of oversight responsibility suggests that professional self-regulation may be inadequate when economic incentives encourage ethical compromises. The development of criminal justice responses to the Burke and Hare case influenced investigation techniques, legal procedures, and public understanding of criminal partnerships and accomplice testimony. Hare's decision to testify against Burke established important precedents for prosecuting criminal partnerships while highlighting the moral ambiguities of granting immunity to equally culpable participants. The extensive public interest in the case also demonstrated how criminal proceedings could serve broader social and political purposes beyond individual justice. The gender and vulnerability dimensions of victim selection reveal how criminal exploitation often targets individuals who lack social power and institutional protection. Several victims were elderly women living alone, individuals whose social isolation made them both easy targets and unlikely to be quickly missed. The case demonstrates how gender intersects with other vulnerability factors such as age, disability, immigrant status, and poverty to create particular risks that criminal enterprises can systematically exploit. The economic history implications of the Burke and Hare case illuminate how illegal markets develop sophisticated distribution networks, pricing mechanisms, and quality assessment systems when legal alternatives are inadequate or unavailable. The body trade operated with remarkable efficiency, suggesting complex organizational structures that connected suppliers, distributors, and consumers across geographic and social boundaries. The transition from grave robbing to murder represented rational economic adaptation to changing market conditions and supply constraints. Contemporary relevance of the Burke and Hare case extends to modern discussions of organ trafficking, medical tourism, and exploitation of vulnerable populations in healthcare contexts. While specific circumstances have changed, underlying dynamics of medical demand, inadequate legal supply, and vulnerable populations remain relevant to contemporary policy discussions. The case provides historical perspective on how criminal enterprises adapt to exploit gaps between medical needs and ethical or legal constraints. The historical memory and commemoration aspects of the Burke and Hare case reveal how traumatic events become embedded in popular culture and collective imagination in ways that may obscure historical complexity. Tourist attractions, fictional adaptations, and folklore have created particular narratives that emphasize sensational aspects while potentially minimizing broader social and institutional implications. Understanding how historical trauma is remembered and commercialized provides insights into how societies process difficult historical legacies. Medical ethics evolution influenced by the Burke and Hare case contributed to developing frameworks for professional responsibility, patient protection, and research oversight that continue to influence contemporary medical practice. The case highlighted the inadequacy of professional self-regulation when economic incentives conflict with ethical requirements. The reforms that followed established precedents for external oversight and legal regulation of medical practice that remain relevant to contemporary discussions of professional accountability. The criminal justice development implications include contributions to investigation methodology, evidence evaluation, and understanding of criminal partnerships that influenced subsequent law enforcement practices. The Burke and Hare case required innovative investigation techniques and legal strategies that established precedents for prosecuting complex criminal enterprises. The extensive documentation and public attention also contributed to developing public understanding of criminal behavior patterns and victim selection strategies. Social reform movements influenced by the Burke and Hare revelations extended beyond medical education to broader discussions of poverty, social protection, and institutional accountability. The case highlighted systematic failures in social support systems that left vulnerable populations without protection or advocacy. The public response contributed to broader reform discussions that addressed underlying social conditions rather than simply responding to immediate criminal activity. The historical lessons for contemporary issues include insights into how institutional failures develop and persist when economic incentives conflict with ethical requirements. The Burke and Hare case demonstrates how professional communities can develop elaborate justification mechanisms that enable systematic ethical compromises while maintaining official respectability. Understanding these historical patterns provides analytical framework for identifying and addressing similar dynamics in contemporary institutional contexts. The broader implications for medical ethics evolution, criminal justice development, and social reform movements suggest that the Burke and Hare case represents more than historical curiosity, but provides analytical framework for understanding how societies navigate tensions between competing values and interests. The case illuminates how criminal activity can emerge from institutional failures and social inequalities, while also demonstrating how public exposure and political pressure can drive comprehensive reform when other mechanisms prove inadequate. The enduring significance of Burke and Hare lies not only in their criminal methodology or the dramatic circumstances of their exposure and prosecution, but in what their case reveals about the complex relationships between professional advancement, social vulnerability, and institutional accountability. Their crimes were enabled by systematic failures that extended far beyond individual moral failings to encompass institutional structures, professional cultures, and social systems that prioritize certain interests while neglecting protection of vulnerable populations. Understanding these broader patterns provides essential context for addressing contemporary challenges that involve similar dynamics of professional responsibility, social protection, and institutional oversight.